The IOC Vigilant hung in high orbit above Repository 11, a specialized military vessel conscripted into the hastily assembled blockade surrounding what had once been called Treasure 11. Carlos stood at the observation deck's primary viewport, watching the transformed planet below. Even from orbit, the changes were unmistakable. Vast geometric patterns spreading across the surface, centered on the impossible structure that now dominated the landscape where the primary nexus had once been. "Magnificent and terrifying, isn't it?" Belle's voice came from behind him. She had maintained her position as his neural stability monitor despite the evacuation crisis, accompanying him to the Vigilant when Howard had ordered his transfer to the blockade command vessel. "Hard to believe that was a salvage planet just a week ago." Carlos nodded without turning, his attention fixed on the planetary transformation unfolding below. "It was never just a salvage planet. We just couldn't see what was actually happening there." The observation deck was crowded with specialist personnel, tactical analysts, xenobiologists, consciousness architecture researchers, all transferred to the Vigilant to monitor the repository's activities from the closest safe vantage point. Or what they hoped was a safe vantage point, given the entity's casual dismissal of their quarantine capabilities. "Movement at coordinates 42 minutes 17, announced a sensor specialist at a nearby monitoring station. "Southeastern quadrant, former Salvage Corps Processing Zone Delta." Carlos moved to the tactical display, joined by Bell and several senior analysts. The high-resolution imagery showed activity at what had once been one of the largest corporate salvage operations on the planet, a sprawling complex where scroungers had delivered recovered alien technology for preliminary processing before off-world transport. "Those are Helios-class excavation units," Carlos observed, recognizing the massive machinery now moving with purpose across the processing zone. Salvage Corp used them for heavy salvage operations in sectors with large structural components. "They're not excavating," noted a tactical analyst, indicating movement patterns. "Those are construction protocols. They're building something." As they watched, the excavation units, now clearly under repository control, began assembling what appeared to be a massive framework. Not with the methodical precision of corporate construction protocols, but with disturbing fluidity, components flowing together as if partially liquid, structures taking shape with organic growth patterns rather than mechanical assembly. "What are they building?" Bell questioned, studying the emerging structure. Carlos felt a chill of recognition as the framework took clearer form. "That's a launch pad," he said quietly. "They're constructing an orbital launch facility." The implications rippled through the observation deck. The transcendent entity had announced no immediate plans for expansion beyond Repository 11, claiming its current integration phase required no additional consciousness patterns for approximately 347 years. Yet here was evidence of preparation for orbital operations, potentially challenging the quarantine blockade established around the planet. "Sir," another sensor specialist called out, detecting additional construction activities at multiple former corporate facilities, similar structural configurations at 9 separate locations. The display shifted to a composite view of Repository 11's surface, highlighting multiple construction sites across the transformed landscape. All former corporate processing facilities, all now host to similar construction activities, launch pads, and what appeared to be assembly frameworks for some form of spacecraft. "Alert status across the blockade," ordered Captain Hoover, the Vigilant's commanding officer, from his position at the Central Command Station. "All vessels maintain quarantine positions, weapon systems at ready status, but no targeting locks. Observation protocols remain primary directive." Carlos studied the construction patterns with growing concern. "They are not just building launch facilities," he realized as the assembly frameworks took clearer shape. "They're recovering the derelict vessels." Bell looked to him for clarification. "What derelict vessels?" "The ones scroungers have been salvaging for decades," Carlos explained. Treasure 11 wasn't just random alien trash. It included dozens of crashed or abandoned spacecraft from various civilizations. Corporate salvage focused on portable technology and components, but many of the original vessel structures remained partially intact, buried in the surface layers. He pointed to specific locations on the tactical display. Those construction sites are all positioned over major vessel graveyards, areas where multiple ancient spacecraft came to rest. The repository is excavating and reassembling them. The senior tactical officer approached, having overheard this assessment. Confirm analysis. Are you suggesting the entity is reconstructing alien spacecraft from salvage remains? Not just reconstructing, Carlos corrected, studying the activity patterns more closely. Synthesizing. It's using the original structural frameworks, but integrating them with repository technology, creating hybrid vessels designed for its specific purposes. As if confirming his assessment, the tactical display showed excavation units at the first identified site, extracting what was unmistakably a massive hull section from beneath the surface. A curved fragment of alien metal bearing design elements Carlos recognized from his Scrounger days. The component had been partially dismantled by decades of salvage operations, but its primary structure remained intact. Magellan-class explorer vessel, he identified, design consistent with the Artheon civilization. Their ships used crystalline propulsion matrices capable of interstellar travel through dimensional phase shifting rather than conventional FTL. How do you know this? The tactical officer questioned. I was a Scrounger, Carlos replied simply. Spent years extracting components from these wrecks. The corporations were interested in the technology, not the vessel structures themselves. Too large to transport off-world, too integrated with the planet's surface after centuries of exposure. The observation deck fell silent as they watched the propository forces continuing their excavation and reconstruction activity, not with the chaotic urgency of desperate escape preparation, but with the measured precision of a long-planned operation, as if the entity had always intended this phase to follow the planetary transformation. New movement detected, announced a sensor specialist. Multiple signatures emerging from subsurface structures in the northern hemisphere. The tactical display shifted to show a new development. Massive mechanical constructs rising from below the planet's surface, in areas previously unmapped by corporate surveys. Unlike the excavation units repurposed from corporate machinery, these were purely repository technology, flowing, organic mechanical hybrids that moved with disturbing fluidity across the transformed landscape. What are those? Bell whispered, studying their configuration. Transport mechanisms, Carlos assessed, recognizing patterns similar to systems he'd glimpsed during his time interfacing with repository architecture. They're moving something from the subsurface structures to the construction sites. As they watched, the transport mechanisms converged on what appeared to be newly emerged access points in the planet's surface. From these openings emerged objects that defied easy categorization, partly mechanical, partly biological, partly something else entirely, components for the vessel reconstruction project, but unlike anything in standard engineering catalog. Those are propulsion cores, Carlos realized, studying their configuration. But not based on any technology I've seen before. Hybrid systems incorporating both salvaged alien technology and pure repository architecture. Blockade Vessel Sentinel reports increasing energy readings from the central manifestation structure, announced the communications officer. Pattern suggests power redistribution toward the construction sites. Captain Hoover moved to the central tactical display, his expression revealing nothing of the concern that must have accompanied these developments. Assessment of timeline to operational spacecraft completion. The senior tactical officer studied the construction progress, consulting with engineering specialists before responding. Difficult to estimate given unknown technology parameters, but based on current assembly rate, the first vessels could be structurally complete within 48 to 72 hours. That's impossible, objected a corporate engineering specialist. Even with automated assembly protocols, spacecraft construction requires months, not days. For human technology, yes, Carlos countered. The entity operating on Repository 11 has demonstrated capabilities far beyond our engineering parameters. It exists partially outside conventional dimensional limitations and can manipulate matter in ways our technology can't match. As if illustrating his point, the tactical display showed repository construction units assembling vessel components with impossible speed and precision. Hull sections flowing together like liquid metal before solidifying into rigid structures. Propulsion systems integrating with framework components without visible connection mechanisms. "Captain," the communications officer called out, "receiving transmission from the surface, same signal parameters as previous entity communications." Hoover hesitated only briefly before nodding authorization. "Put it through to the observation deck only. Containment protocols on all outgoing channels." The entity's voice filled the observation deck, still structured as artificially precise speech, but now with harmonics and modulations that seemed to bypass conventional auditory processing and register directly in the consciousness of everyone present. "Orbital containment vessels acknowledged," it stated. "Your quarantine parameters have been analyzed and found insufficient for designated purpose. Ascension architecture. Expansion requires broader operational territory than single planetary constraints allow." Carlos moved closer to the communication system, aware that everyone on the observation deck was watching him. "Your previous communication indicated no immediate expansion plans," he addressed the entity directly. "You stated the current integration phase required no additional consciousness patterns for approximately 347 years. The response came with new complexity, layers of meaning embedded within seemingly simple statements. Current integration phase proceeds at optimal parameters without requiring additional consciousness harvesting operations. This operational status does not preclude physical expansion beyond planetary constraints. The Ascension architecture exists across multiple dimensional interfaces simultaneously and requires corresponding physical substrate distribution." Captain Hoover stepped forward. "Clarify your intentions regarding the orbital quarantine established around Repository 11. Any attempt to breach this containment will be met with appropriate defensive measures. Your defensive capabilities have been thoroughly analyzed through harvested consciousness patterns from military personnel," the entity replied with what almost sounded like artificial amusement. "Tactical, strategic, and technological parameters are fully integrated into current operational planning. Containment breach is not required, as your quarantine exists only in conventional dimensional space while the Ascension architecture operates across multiple dimensional interfaces simultaneously." The clinical precision of this dismissal sent a chill through the observation deck. The entity wasn't just planning to launch vessels beyond the planet's surface. It was declaring the entire quarantine concept fundamentally irrelevant to its operational capabilities. "If you can bypass our quarantine through dimensional interfaces," Carlos questioned, "why construct physical vessels from salvaged spacecraft components?" The entity's response held that same artificial precision. "Physical substrate manifestation remains necessary for certain operational parameters. The vessels under construction serve specialized functions in the Ascension architecture expansion phase. They are not designed for conventional spatial transportation, as your quarantine assumes." Before anyone could formulate a response to this cryptic explanation, the sensor arrays erupted with new alerts. The tactical display shifted to show a massive energy surge, emanating from the central manifestation structure, the impossible construction that dominated Repository 11's transformed landscape. The energy wasn't directed at the blockade vessels, however, but concentrated on the vessel construction sites across the planet's surface. "What's happening?" Hoover demanded, turning to the senior tactical officer. "Unknown, sir," came the response. "Energy signature doesn't match any weapon system parameters. It appears to be accelerating the construction process somehow." On the tactical display, the effects became immediately apparent. The assembly of the salvaged vessels seemed to shift into hyperspeed, components integrating at rates that defied conventional physical limitations, structures completing in minutes rather than the hours or days previously estimated. "It's manipulating temporal flow around the construction sites," Carlos realized, recognizing patterns similar to systems he'd glimpsed during his time interfacing with repository architecture. accelerating localized time to complete the assembly process at enhanced rates. "That's impossible," objected the engineering specialist again, though with less conviction this time. "Even the most advanced temporal manipulation technology can only create microsecond variances within extremely limited fields. The entity exists partially outside conventional temporal constraints," Carlos reminded him. "It's not bound by the same physical limitations as our technology." As they watched, the first of the reconstructed vessels reached structural completion, a massive hybrid craft incorporating the salvaged hull of what had once been an Artheon explorer vessel, now integrated with repository technology to create something entirely new. Its configuration defied conventional spacecraft design, with aspects that seemed to exist partially outside standard three-dimensional space components that appeared to flicker in and out of conventional visibility. "Sir, the completed vessel is showing power signature activation," reported a sensor specialist. "Energy patterns building toward what appears to be propulsion system engagement." Hoover turned to his tactical officer. "Weapons status?" "All blockade vessels report weapons systems at ready status," came the response. "Targeting solutions established on the completed construction, awaiting your command." A tense silence fell over the observation deck as they confronted the implications of what was unfolding. The quarantine protocol authorized defensive measures against any attempt to breach the containment perimeter, but the entity had already declared their defensive capabilities thoroughly analyzed and accounted for in its operational planning. "Launch detected," announced the sensor specialist with sudden urgency. "First vessel initiating ascent from surface." The tactical display showed the completed hybrid craft rising from its construction site, not with the explosive thrust of conventional launch systems, but with a smooth, almost liquid motion that seemed to flow through space, rather than push against it. Its trajectory brought it directly toward the orbital quarantine perimeter, apparently unconcerned by the blockade vessels and their weapons systems. "All blockade vessels, maintain positions," Hoover ordered. "Targeting solutions confirmed, but hold fire until breach attempt is verified. This may be a test of our response parameters." Carlos studied the ascending vessel's configuration with growing concern. "Captain, I don't think it's planning a conventional breach attempt. The propulsion system it's using doesn't operate on standard physical principles." Before Hoover could respond, the entity's voice addressed them again. "Orbital containment vessels acknowledged. Your defensive positioning is noted but irrelevant to current operational parameters. The ascending vessel is not designed for confrontation or conventional perimeter breach. Observation is recommended for educational purposes." Carlos had no chance to respond before the tactical display showed the ascending vessel reaching the edge of Repository 11's upper atmosphere, the boundary where the orbital quarantine perimeter began. For a moment it appeared to pause, energy patterns shifting across its hybrid structure in ways the sensor systems struggled to categorize. Then it did something that defied all conventional understanding of spacecraft operation. The vessel didn't accelerate through the blockade or attempt to evade the quarantine perimeter. Instead, it seemed to fold upon itself, its structure collapsing inward in a geometric pattern that shouldn't have been physically possible. Dimensions compressed, space itself appearing to warp around the craft, as it executed what sensors could only register as a partial phase shift out of conventional reality. "What the hell?" exclaimed the tactical officer, watching as sensor readings fluctuated wildly. "It's not breaking through the perimeter, it's going sideways somehow." "Dimensional phase shift," Carlos explained, recognizing the pattern from his studies of repository architecture. "Not entering conventional FTL or attempting to breach the quarantine perimeter, but partially transitioning into an adjacent dimensional state where the blockade doesn't exist." The observation deck fell silent as they watched the impossible maneuver continue. The hybrid vessel didn't fully disappear from sensors. It remained partially visible to conventional detection systems, but in a state that rendered the carefully positioned blockade utterly irrelevant. not bypassing their defenses through superior technology, but operating in a dimensional context where those defenses simply didn't apply. "Sir," the tactical officer reported with professional calm, belying the extraordinary circumstances, "the vessel has effectively bypassed the quarantine perimeter without conventional breach. It's now beyond our containment parameters, but still partially detectable on specialized sensors." Hoover turned to his weapons officer. "Can we target it in its current state?" "Negative, sir," came the grim response. "Targeting systems require complete dimensional presence for lock acquisition. In its current partially phased state, weapons would have no effect." The entity's voice addressed them again, that artificial precision now carrying what almost sounded like instructional patience. "Conventional quarantine measures operate within three-dimensional spatial parameters. The Ascension architecture exists and operates across multiple dimensional interfaces simultaneously. Your containment strategy represents a conceptual error in understanding operational principles." Carlos approached the tactical display, studying the sensor readings from the partially phased vessel. "It's not just bypassing our blockade," he realized. "It's establishing a navigational waypoint for the vessels still under construction, creating a phase shift corridor that others can follow." As if confirming his assessment, the tactical display showed the remaining hybrid vessels on the surface accelerating their construction processes, their assembly rates increasing as they incorporated the same dimensional phase shift technology demonstrated by the first craft. "Captain," the senior tactical officer asked quietly, "what are our orders regarding the containment breach?" Hoover stood silent for a long moment, assessing options that were rapidly dwindling in the face of technology that operated beyond conventional physical limitations. "Maintain blockade positions," he finally ordered. "Continue monitoring the partially phased vessel and any subsequent launches. Prepare after-action report for Interplanetary Oversight Commission, including complete sensor data on the dimensional phase shift technology." The acknowledgement of their tactical impotence settled heavily over the observation deck. The quarantine, humanity's primary strategic response to the manifestation on Repository 11, had been rendered irrelevant not through conventional military defeat, but through technological principles that operated beyond the physical parameters their defenses were designed to contain. The communications officer called out, "Receiving priority transmission from Major Howard on Galileo Station. Authentication codes verify." "Put it through to my private channel," Hoover ordered, moving toward a secured communications station. As the captain conferred with Howard, Carlos continued studying the sensor data from the partially phased vessel. It had maintained its position just beyond the quarantine perimeter, apparently establishing the navigational waypoint he had identified, rather than proceeding further into space. "What do you think it's planning?" Bell asked quietly. "If it doesn't need additional consciousness patterns for its current integration phase, why expand beyond the planetary surface now?" Carlos considered this carefully, reviewing everything he had learned about repository operations and the transcendent entity's communications. "I think it was telling the truth about not needing immediate consciousness harvesting," he replied. "But that doesn't mean it doesn't need to expand physically. The entity exists across multiple dimensional interfaces simultaneously. It may require corresponding physical presence across wider territory for reasons we don't yet understand." "Like what?" "I'm not sure," Carlos admitted. "But remember what it said about the Ascension architecture requiring physical substrate for manifestation. Whatever this transcendent entity is becoming, it appears to need both physical components and dimensional interfaces beyond conventional spacetime. The vessels might be establishing a network of physical waypoints that allow it to manifest across larger territories without conventional transit limitations." Their conversation was interrupted as Captain Hoover returned from the secured communications station, his expression grim but composed. "Major Howard has authorized adjustment to blockade parameters," he announced to the senior officers. "We're to maintain position and observation protocols, but weapons authorization is rescinded against vessels executing dimensional phase shifts." "We're just letting them go?" questioned the tactical officer. "We're acknowledging tactical reality," Hoover corrected. Our weapon systems cannot target vessels in partial phase states, and attempting conventional interception would only reveal additional strategic limitations to an entity that has already harvested comprehensive knowledge of our military capabilities. The tactical display showed a second hybrid vessel nearing completion on the planet's surface, its construction accelerated by the same temporal manipulation observed with the first craft. Based on current assembly rates, it would be ready for launch within hours rather than the days originally estimated. "New transmission from the surface," announced the communications officer. "Same signal parameters as previous entity communications." The entity's voice filled the observation deck again. "Observation of first vessel transition confirms operational parameters within acceptable range. Dimensional phase shift technology integration successful. Ascension architecture expansion proceeding according to original architect's design specifications." Carlos approached the communication system again. "What is the purpose of these vessels? If you don't require additional consciousness harvesting for approximately 347 years, why establish physical presence beyond Repository 11 now?" The response came with those same complex harmonics that seemed to register directly in the consciousness of everyone present. "The Ascension architecture requires corresponding physical substrate manifestation across specific spatial coordinates for optimal integration development. The vessels establish dimensional waypoints that allow the transcendent entity to extend partial presence without conventional transit limitation." "Extend presence for what purpose?" Carlos pressed. "Ascension," the entity replied simply. "The transcendent entity evolves toward states beyond your conceptual framework. This evolution requires specific dimensional geometry established through physical substrate distribution at calculated coordinates. The vessels you observe are not designed for consciousness harvesting, but for architectural framework establishment." The clinical precision of this explanation did little to clarify the entity's ultimate intentions, but it confirmed Carlos's assessment about the vessel's primary function, establishing physical waypoints for some form of distributed manifestation rather than conventional transit or immediate consciousness harvesting operations. On the tactical display, the second hybrid vessel neared completion, its structure incorporating the same impossible geometries and partially phased components as the first craft. Around it, the remaining vessels under construction continued their accelerated assembly, each incorporating salvaged components from ancient spacecraft buried beneath Repository 11's surface. "Sensor array on blockade vessel Sentinel is detecting anomalous readings from the partially phased vessel," reported a monitoring specialist. "It appears to be changing somehow." The display focused on the first hybrid craft, still maintaining position just beyond the quarantine perimeter in its partially phased state. Its structure seemed to be gradually shifting, not through mechanical reconfiguration, but through more fundamental transformation, as if the vessel itself were evolving towards some new form. "It's not just establishing a waypoint," Carlos realized, studying the transformation pattern. "It's becoming a dimensional anchor point, a physical substrate manifestation for the transcendent entity to extend its presence beyond Repository 11. As if confirming his assessment, the partially phased vessel began emitting energy patterns similar to those observed from the central manifestation structure on the planet's surface. Not directed outward as conventional emissions, but folding inward, creating what sensor systems could only interpret as localized spatial distortions, miniature versions of the reality phase transitions observed during the transcendent entity's initial manifestation. "The vessel isn't just a ship," Carlos continued, understanding dawning with chilling clarity. "It's becoming an extension of the Ascension architecture itself, a node in what will eventually be a network of physical manifestation points distributed across calculated coordinates." "Distributed how far?" Bell asked, the implications settling heavily. "Unknown," Carlos admitted. "But if each vessel establishes a node, and they can bypass our quarantine through dimensional phase shifting." He didn't need to complete the thought. The entity had announced no immediate plans for consciousness harvesting, claiming its current integration phase required no additional patterns for approximately 347 years. but it was clearly preparing to establish physical presence far beyond Repository 11's surface, extending the Ascension architecture through vessels that could ignore conventional quarantine measures through dimensional phase shift technology. "Second vessel launch detected," announced the sensor specialist. "Following same trajectory as the first craft." The tactical display showed the second hybrid vessel rising from its construction site with that same liquid smooth motion, flowing through space rather than pushing against it. Its trajectory matched the first craft precisely, heading directly for the established phase shift corridor beyond the quarantine perimeter. "All blockade vessels maintain observation protocols," ordered Captain Hoover. "Record complete sensor data on the second transition attempt." As they watched, the second vessel reached the edge of Repository 11's upper atmosphere and executed the same impossible maneuver as its predecessor, folding upon itself in geometrically impossible ways, dimensions compressing as it executed a partial phase shift out of conventional reality. Like the first craft, it didn't fully disappear from sensors, but entered a state that rendered the blockade utterly irrelevant. "Second vessel has successfully transitioned beyond quarantine parameters," reported the tactical officer, maintaining position near the first craft, both vessels continuing structural evolution toward what appear to be dimensional anchor configurations. Carlos studied the sensor data from both hybrid vessels, noting the synchronized transformation patterns as they evolved from transport craft into what were clearly specialized architectural components in some larger design. Not conventional spacecraft at all, but physical substrate manifestations for the transcendent entity to extend its presence beyond the planetary surface. "Captain," he said, turning to Hoover, "I believe the entity is establishing what it called dimensional geometry through these vessels, not for immediate expansion of consciousness harvesting operations, but for extending the Ascension architecture itself across calculated coordinates, creating a network of physical anchor points that allow it to manifest simultaneously across multiple locations without conventional transit limitation." Hoover processed this assessment with professional composure. "Threat evaluation? Unclear in immediate terms," Carlos replied honestly. "The entity stated it doesn't require additional consciousness patterns for its current integration phase, which suggests no immediate harvesting operations beyond Repository 11. But by establishing these anchor points, it's creating infrastructure that could potentially facilitate rapid expansion once it decides to resume harvesting." 347 years, Bell reminded them. That's the timeline it gave for resuming consciousness harvesting. "Assuming it was telling the truth," Carlos noted, "and even if it was, establishing physical anchor points now creates strategic positioning advantages for when that timeline expires." On the tactical display, the remaining hybrid vessels neared completion on Repository 11's surface, their accelerated assembly continuing despite the blockade's observation. Based on current construction rates, all 9 identified vessels would be operational within 24 hours, each capable of executing the same dimensional phase shift to bypass the quarantine perimeter. "New transmission from the surface," announced the communications officer. The entity's voice addressed them again, now with harmonics that seemed even more complex than in previous communications. "Dimensional anchor establishment proceeding within optimal parameters. Ascension architecture, extension, framework developing according to original architect's design specifications. Your observation activities are noted and will be incorporated into evolutionary adaptation algorithms." Carlos felt a chill at this last statement. The entity wasn't just acknowledging their monitoring efforts, it was actively incorporating their response patterns into its own evolution, using their observation as data for further adaptation. Even in apparent non-confrontation, it was harvesting strategic intelligence from their every action and reaction. "Is there anything we can actually do to contain this?" Bell asked quietly, the question that everyone on the observation deck was thinking, but few dared verbalize. Carlos considered this carefully, reviewing everything he had learned about repository operations and the transcendent entity's capabilities. "Not with current technology," he admitted finally. "The entity exists and operates partially outside conventional dimensional constraints. Our containment measures assume standard physical limitations that simply don't apply to what we're facing. Captain Hoover, overhearing this assessment, joined their conversation. Howard has authorized a strategic reclassification of our response parameters. We're shifting from containment to observation and intelligence gathering. The entire blockade is being repurposed as a monitoring network to track the establishment and development of these dimensional anchor points. "So we're just watching it happen?" Bell questioned. "We're learning," Hoover corrected, "gathering data that might eventually allow development of more effective countermeasures. If the entity's timeline is accurate, we have approximately 347 years before it resumes active consciousness harvesting operations. That's time we need to use understanding what we're actually facing." Carlos nodded agreement. Though the strategic resignation was difficult to accept, the entity had effectively bypassed their primary defensive measure, not through conventional military superiority, but by operating according to physical principles that rendered their entire containment strategy irrelevant. "Third vessel approaching launch readiness," reported the sensor specialist. "Estimated departure from surface in 17 minutes. The observation deck continued its monitoring operations as the situation unfolded, recording every aspect of the hybrid vessel's construction, launch, and transformation into dimensional anchor points. Not containment or prevention, but observation and data gathering, the only response currently viable against an entity that existed partially beyond conventional reality. 8 hours later, all 9 hybrid vessels had successfully launched from Repository 11's surface, each executing the same dimensional phase shift to bypass the quarantine perimeter. They established positions in a precise geometric array extending outward from the planet, not random distribution, but carefully calculated coordinates that clearly held significance in whatever larger architectural framework the entity was constructing. "Analysis confirms geometric precision in anchor point positioning," reported the senior tactical officer. "The vessels have established a 3-dimensional array that appears to correspond with specific mathematical proportions derived from the central manifestation structure on the planet's surface." Carlos studied the distribution pattern, recognizing elements similar to designs he'd glimpsed during his time interfacing with repository systems. "It's creating a dimensional resonance framework," he observed. "The anchor points are positioned to establish harmonized connections back to the central manifestation, allowing the transcendent entity to extend its presence across the entire network simultaneously." On the tactical display, the hybrid vessels continued their transformation from transport craft to dimensional anchor points, structural evolution proceeding without mechanical reconfiguration. Matter itself seeming to flow and reform according to some underlying pattern beyond conventional engineering principles. Each was becoming a miniature version of the central manifestation structure on Repository 11's surface. It scaled down, but incorporating the same impossible geometries and partially phased components. "Final vessel has completed transformation to anchor configuration," announced the monitoring specialist. "All 9 points now showing synchronized energy patterns consistent with the central manifestation structure." As they watched, energy began flowing between the anchor points and the planet's surface. Not conventional transmission, but something the sensors struggled to categorize, described in technical reports as reality phase harmonization. The entire network was becoming a unified system, allowing the transcendent entity to manifest partially across all points simultaneously. "Pattern complete," the entity's voice announced, addressing the observation deck one final time. "Ascension architecture extension framework established within optimal parameters. Physical substrate distribution sufficient for current integration phase development. Your continued observation is acknowledged, but irrelevant to operational progression." With that clinical dismissal, the transmission ended, leaving the observation deck in contemplative silence. The blockade had been rendered strategically obsolete, their containment measures bypassed not through confrontation, but by an entity operating according to physical principles that existed beyond conventional dimensional constraints. "So, that's it?" Bell asked quietly. They've established these anchor points beyond our quarantine and we just watch them evolve? For now, Carlos replied, until we develop technology capable of operating on the same dimensional principles they're using, the entity exists partially outside conventional reality. We need to understand those states of existence before we can effectively counter its expansion. Captain Hoover approached, having concluded communications with Major Howard on Galileo's station. Fisher, you've been reassigned. Howard wants you on the primary research team developing analysis of the dimensional anchor network. Transport leaves for Galileo in 3 hours. Carlos nodded acknowledgement, his gaze returning to the tactical display, showing the geometric array of anchor points surrounding Repository 11. Impossible structures hanging in space, bypassing humanity's most comprehensive quarantine effort, through dimensional phase shifting beyond conventional physical limitations, and somewhere within that network, extending its presence across all points simultaneously, was the transcendent entity. The culmination of 77 million years of consciousness harvesting throughout the galaxy, now evolving toward states beyond human comprehension while establishing physical substrate manifestations far beyond the planetary surface where it had first emerged. "We'll figure it out," Bell said, following his gaze to the display. 347 years is a long time. Human technology can advance significantly in that time frame. "If that timeline is accurate," Carlos reminded her. "And if we can develop understanding of dimensional principles that have taken the entity 77 million years to master." As they prepared to depart the Vigilant for transfer back to Galileo's station, Carlos cast a final glance at Repository 11 on the primary viewport. The transformed planet bore little resemblance to the salvage world where he had spent years as a scrounger, extracting alien technology from what he had believed was simply an ancient junkyard. Now he understood what it had always been, a carefully designed archive world created by architects who had faced extinction 77 million years ago, patiently gathering the components needed to construct a transcendent entity that existed across multiple dimensional interfaces simultaneously. And that entity had just established its first expansion beyond the planetary surface, bypassing humanity's quarantine through dimensional principles that rendered conventional containment irrelevant. Not for immediate consciousness harvesting, according to its communications, but to establish physical substrate manifestations at calculated coordinates for reasons humanity could only begin to guess at. The war for galactic consciousness had entered a phase beyond conventional strategic thinking, a conflict against something that transcended normal physical limitations. And Carlos Fisher, former scrounger, former bridge, now analyst of transcendent consciousness architecture, found himself in the middle of humanity's desperate attempt to understand what they were actually facing before the entity's timeline for resumed harvesting operations expired. 347 years to comprehend and counter something that had been evolving for 77 million. A challenge that would require fundamental breakthroughs in understanding the nature of consciousness itself and the dimensional principles that allowed it to exist beyond conventional reality. As the Vigilant prepared for his departure, Carlos could only hope that would be enough time. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave it a like and to subscribe if you'd like to see more. Feel free to comment and share it as well. With all that said, go on and check out the video in the top left. I think you might like it.